Alison is an anthropologist, educator, and founder and director of the Human-Beaver Coexistence Fund, based in Northern Virginia, where she works to help landowners and managers practice non-lethal beaver management and to promote human-wildlife coexistence. Welcome, Alison, to the stage.
Thank you for being here. Now that you all have sat through 3 days of beaver talk, I'm going to talk to you about some monkeys. We're going to mix it up a little bit. Also, the title of my talk is quite a lot, so I'm just going to jump right into it. So just a quick note about my journey from monkeys to beavers. I have bachelor's and master's degrees in anthropology, and originally I studied cultural anthropology and religion, and then I got into primatology, studied some lemurs. Then I became an ethnoprimatologist, which is someone who studies the interactions between humans and non-human primates. And my specific research interest in that role was to study crop-raiding monkeys. And fast forward some years, like Adam said, now I am the founder and director of Human-Beaver Coexistence Fund, but I like to fancy myself an ethno-beaverologist. And I'm gonna get more into that. And this is like me as a baby primatologist and then now just full-blown like crazy beaver lady. Also, a fun story, I attended BeaverCon 2020. For one day, I was barely dipping my toe into the beaver waters. And this is like a cautionary tale for all you young students out there. This year, I was on the planning committee, giving 2 talks, here the whole time, and I'm just like fully in it now. So the beaver folks are so welcoming and wonderful. So let's get into the meat of this talk. I'm going to talk about kind of human-beaver stuff within this framework of human-wildlife conflict and coexistence. And so right out of the gate, we're going to define what human-wildlife conflict actually means. And I say that as if it's kind of an easy thing to define, but there's so many different definitions of this concept, and this is one of them. It is when struggles arise because the presence or behavior of wildlife is posing either an actual or perceived direct recurring threat to human interests or needs, and that's kind of the core definition. And then it often leads to disagreements between groups of people and can have negative impacts on people and or wildlife, which that is just a lot to take in. But one of the ways that I have thought about human-wildlife conflict over the years, and a common critique of this concept now, is that often human-wildlife conflict is actually human-human conflict over wildlife. And that means that if we look at this graphic here, you see an iceberg, and then you've got the dispute, which is literally like the animal and the human coming into some sort of conflict. But then when you look deeper, there's that underlying conflict where the issue itself maybe has been not resolved over time. There's some social things coming into play. And then at the very bottom of that iceberg is this deep-rooted conflict where people's identities, where values are being threatened, and it's really no longer about the wildlife at all. It's very, very human. So that's how we're framing this. And so then we define human-wildlife coexistence, and I've been just like listening to everyone over the past 3 days and thinking about how many times I've heard the word coexistence and used it myself, and I thought if I had like $1 for every time I've heard the word coexistence, I wouldn't have to fundraise for my organization anymore. We all use this term. It's such a buzzy word, but it can be really hard to define. So the definition that I currently like is that human-wildlife coexistence is a process that encompasses the well-being of people and the ethical management, and you could say well-being, of wildlife in a shared space. And what's important to really call out here is that conflict and coexistence, this is not a dichotomy. These are not like mutually exclusive things. This is a continuum or a spectrum, which this little image implies. And it's just a framework for thinking about our work with wildlife and humans that encourages us to think at a more systems level, that we understand that it's this dynamic, evolving, ever-changing concept that has all of these influences from human culture, ecology, politics, et cetera, et cetera. And I would also like to point out that when we say coexistence, it doesn't necessarily imply that the interactions between humans and wildlife are positive or even mutually beneficial. And also to say that there's no point on this continuum where conflict becomes coexistence. It's much more complex than that. This is my wetlands slide. I'm now going to take you to my jungle slide. So what I wanted to do is to compare my work with monkeys with my work with beavers, to give kind of like an example for this framework being more broadly applied. So I'm taking you to this little island. It's actually not that little. It's one of the larger islands in the Indonesian archipelago. It's called Sulawesi. This is a great picture of my field site there, which was in an agricultural area in the southern part of the island where that red represents. It was a forest farm matrix type environment where people are farming right next to forests and protected areas that have groups of this cute little Moor macaque monkey, that's spelled M-O-O-R. It is an endemic species to the island of Sulawesi. It is endangered, and it is one of 7 endemic endangered macaque species just on this island. And so, in comparison or contrast to our beaver work, whenever there is human-wildlife conflict with an endangered species, you can see how people get just immediately worked up. And so this is a camera trap photo from my research of 6 monkeys just helping themselves to some corn. So this is the crop raiding behavior that I was looking at with this species. Very briefly, these were my research questions when I was in the field in Sulawesi. I was curious if the composition and structure of the monkey's forest habitat had any potential implications for their crop raiding behavior and patterns of that behavior. And what I found was basically no, that this anthropogenically altered forest where the monkeys that I was studying were living, it is suitable quality habitat for this species, and so that didn't really help explain anything. And then I was curious about the relationship between specifically the fruit, which is primarily what this species eats, although they're omnivorous and eat lots of different things. The relationship between the forest fruit and the patterns of crop raiding. And so I studied this, I did a lot of phenology, and then I also had camera traps like you saw a picture from up in the gardens so that I could compare the patterns of when the fruit in the forest is available and when the crops are available in the gardens and farms. There was no significant relationship here either, which suggests that all of these other factors were helping to kind of lead to greater crop raiding likelihood. And then finally, I had an ethnographic component of this project, which was about how the farmers perceived the issue of crop raiding. And what I found from interviewing the farmers, learning to speak Indonesian, and just having tons of conversations like in the watermelon field while I'm like eating the fruits of their labor, it was amazing, that human-macaque relationships were highly contextual, and that the negative perceptions the farmers had of the actual raiding behavior didn't actually lead to them retaliating against the monkeys or posing a real threat to the monkey population at this site. So I came away knowing that coexistence and even conflict doesn't necessarily imply a conservation concern with this endangered species. So that's an overview of my monkey work. We're going to, probably the crux of this whole presentation is this Venn diagram where I'm comparing now the work I did then with the work that I do now with beavers and human conflict. So we talked about conservation status already. We're comparing an endangered species with a not endangered at all species. I was definitely involved in the monkey side from more of a research perspective, and now I'm definitely more in the applied and management side of things with my beaver work. So that's just an important detail to call out. And now getting more into the meat of it, one of the main differences, oh, by the way, caveat, these are some generalizations based on the work in the specific communities that I've done. So I'm not suggesting that it's like this everywhere, and as we know, beaver work looks different anywhere that you are in the country or world. So, the farmers that I worked with had a much higher foundation of knowledge about the species that they were sharing space with. They had been living for so long in this island, in this very specific place, where they had just a much greater knowledge of the ecology around them. Compared to the landowners that I work with, actually in Northern Virginia and kind of here in this region, that the landowners seem to have a much lower base level of knowledge about the species that they're finding themselves in conflict with. That is related to the next point, which is that in my monkey work, these species, the conflict species, had a more direct effect on the livelihood of those people that I was working with, the farmers. Their harvest, the money that they could get for their harvest was directly impacted by the monkeys damaging and consuming those crops. And again, here in my work with landowners, typically that's a more indirect, if at all, effect on livelihood. Not to say that it couldn't be direct and very serious in other cases. Also, the changes that monkeys make to a landscape are kind of hard to see, takes a long time to observe, and for example, when monkeys are seed dispersers in their forest habitats, that's a good thing for the farmers because it's improving the forest health. They are, pooping out the seeds of the other forest trees that if monkeys like to eat, farmers like to eat. They're collecting resources in the forest, and so those monkeys being there are having some desired effects on the forest. In contrast, the changes to the landscape that beavers make are often, they're obviously much more severe, more noticeable, they happen very quickly, and they're less desired by the landowners. That one's related to the next point here, which is the reaction of the farmer versus the landowner. The farmers that I worked with accepted that crop raiding was an inevitable experience, and they accepted that a certain portion of their harvest would be lost to crop raiding animals. And landowners' reaction to beaver conflict, in my experience, is usually that they're surprised these beavers have shown up at all, and they are relatively much more intolerant of those changes to the landscape and potential damages. So to kind of really sum this all up, I always say that if I am standing in front of a room full of farmers, and they're asking me, how do I stop monkeys from eating my crops? And then I'm standing in a room full of landowners saying, how do I stop beavers from causing flood damage? I want to be in the beaver room every time because there are more affordable and effective solutions available for the beaver problem compared to the monkey problem. I don't want to offend anyone here, but if we start to consider these animals themselves, the monkeys are more intelligent, more agile. This is just a fact, right? If we think about trying to keep a beaver away from a tree versus trying to keep a monkey away from a tree, you can imagine the challenges and how much harder it would be to be facing that room full of farmers. And then the really cool part of this is this overlapping space in the middle of this diagram. Monkeys and beavers are very adaptable species. They can thrive in very wilderness type areas. They can also thrive in more suburban and urban areas. I also have experienced this concept of conditional tolerance with humans regarding both of these species. And what that means is when we think of that continuum, even an individual farmer or landowner can kind of vacillate from conflict to coexistence depending on their experience in the moment. So for example, these farmers, they would encounter these monkeys in the forest and be like, oh, there are the monkeys. I have no ill feelings toward those monkeys. But when they're engaged in the crop raiding behavior, then they hate the monkeys because of how that's impacting them. And I've seen very similar, and you all probably have your own stories of this with beavers where, oh, I enjoy watching the beaver in this protected area, but if it crosses the property boundary and starts flooding my driveway or whatever, then they're suddenly very intolerant of the beavers. So, conditional tolerance is what I call that. I also believe that they're both kind of a scapegoat species. And what that means for the monkeys is that there are other animals raiding crops in Sulawesi. My camera traps were running 24/7, and I also got pictures of wild pigs, civets, which were non-native, and lots of like small rodents like rats. All of those raiders were nocturnal. The monkeys were the only diurnal, very large social groups, very conspicuous raider, and so they were blamed for a lot of the damage that was potentially caused by other species. Similarly, we can probably all think of examples about how beavers are scapegoats for other problems. Oftentimes it's just groundhogs in the cases that I deal with, but I also shared a story last night about a site in Virginia where there was flooding due to lots and lots of reasons, including a tidal creek, tree loss, and all this stuff, and they just trapped out the beavers because they needed something to blame. So, scapegoat species. And then finally, as with any human-wildlife conflict, there's no single solution. So don't ever fall into the myth of the single solution. We're not searching for like a, ta-da, this is the one answer, but it's often just lots and lots of little things. So. I'm going to breeze past this because I'm the last talk and I don't want you all to hate me, so I'm going to keep moving. So, how do we move from conflict toward coexistence? Again, seeing that this is not just like a one-way street, but to kind of just think about it that way, and how do we apply it to our own beaver work? Self-reflection is so important. And a lot of the things I'm going to say on the next two slides are echoing what others have said throughout the past few days. But I'll share my own personal experience here. So first of all, one of the reasons why I moved from monkeys to beavers is because I left that experience in the field in Indonesia, believing that I had no more business traveling across the world to engage with how other people were interacting with their native wildlife. The farmers were using deterrence methods to address the raiding problems that had been working for them already for generations. They're the ones who know how to handle it best, and what am I going to contribute to that? My ancestors did not overlap with monkeys. It's not in my own cultural heritage, and so that's one of the reasons why I kind of transitioned into working with beavers in my own home. And also, another thing, like personal biases. So another thing that I was debating on sharing, but I will, is that my personal, even in my work with Human-Beaver Coexistence Fund, my personal values and beliefs are often kind of at odds with my work with landowners. For example, all this great talk we do about ecosystem services and applying a dollar number to what the value of the beaver, all of that makes me like, ooh, because I personally believe that beavers are inherently valuable. Like, they're deserving of coexistence because they also exist on the planet. And I'm never gonna say that to a landowner, but that's always like what's in my heart when I'm doing this work. And so don't be ashamed of those feelings, those thoughts. Like self-reflect, acknowledge that maybe what you're doing, what you're saying to someone and what you're thinking are different. That's totally okay, and we should be having those conversations more with each other, I personally believe. Also, if it wasn't obvious from kind of the definition of these things, is to consider the human systems that are underlying conflict. Things like equity, racism, imbalances of power, all these very human things that sometimes in our environmental ecology like fields, we're like a little bit weary of going there, but so important to our work, whether we realize it or not. We can really think about this from the base question of what drives human behaviors. And specific to beaver work, asking ourselves, when is the problem the beavers themselves, and when is something else hindering coexistence in our work? One of the interesting things about beavers that I often say is that they are one of the examples I can think of where sometimes it is just human-wildlife conflict. Again, that's because the beavers are having such a severe impact on the landscape in such a small amount of time. But we can still be asking ourselves these questions. Also, at any opportunity, study human behavior change. So this is something I'm working on. I've done multiple trainings about it, but Sarah talked about this yesterday. Knowledge is not what's going to change behavior. Just teaching people the facts is not what's going to do it. So we have to dive in a little deeper to what are the motivations and how do we appeal to people in these creative, sometimes, ways. We can also ask, when and why do people tolerate beavers? So I didn't talk about this idea of a tolerance threshold, but it's this concept, it's, again, still a moving thing on that spectrum, but focus on people whose perspectives have changed over time and why, and then we start to understand those things better. Also engaging with communities and all of our stakeholders with respect. During the working group conversation yesterday, this came up multiple times. It made me super happy, but my own example, so when I was in the field in Indonesia, I was the monkey person. And I don't know how many times I was telling farmers, no, I'm a people person. And I'm interested in your interactions with the monkeys, but I'm not the monkey person. I don't care about the monkeys more than I care about your own experiences. And I'm trying to be the same with I don't want to be the beaver lady. I want to be the human lady who's working on the beaver issues. And that's why the name human is in our organization, the first word in Human-Beaver Coexistence Fund. Focusing on common interests. This is, so whenever I say Human-Beaver Coexistence Fund, people are like, what are human beavers? And I always think of this Animorphs book cover. That guy right in the middle is a human beaver, I guess. So again, this has been said already, but focusing on our common interests, Sarah quoted Catherine Hayhoe. I'm going to do a second plug for her work with talking to people who believe different things about us with climate change. Also in the beaver world, not vilifying the trappers and people who maybe are approaching this work a little differently than us, but I won't go down that hole. But always being aware of potential unintended, not even ecological ripple effects, because that's something we're always thinking about, especially with like relocation and that sort of thing, but cultural ripple effects, like how is our beaver work having a reciprocal effect on those social, cultural processes. Work with each other. What can we learn from each other's successes and failures? Again, at this conference, people have been sharing their failures, especially with flow devices. That's so important. That's how we learn from each other and have more successes. Also, we've talked about how words matter so much. I'll share from my monkey experience. I had an existential crisis. So we were about to start publishing from the data that I collected in Indonesia, and I could not decide to call it crop rating or crop foraging. And my graduate advisor wanted to call it foraging because that's from the monkey's perspective. Ecologically, that's what they're doing. A farm is just another place where a monkey is looking for food. And I was like, but wait, the monkeys aren't the ones reading our papers. And to be fair, neither are the farmers that I worked with, but crop rating is something that to me acknowledges the human experience of the monkey's behavior. So I went back and forth for so long. Now I still say crop rating. I could argue either way, but this is one of these things that when you're looking at it from this more human perspective, these are the questions that start to come up. And then I already gave you my human beaver example. Something I think the beaver world is doing so well is, and that we can continue to do, is scaling up from species-specific messaging to the landscape level. So we're all connecting what we do to larger issues like wetland habitat, stream restoration, water quality, and all of that good stuff. So keep up the good work there. So to summarize, what does successful beaver coexistence look like? It requires an understanding of these things. and an understanding of existing conflicts at our local and regional scales. And that means like what the human perceptions of beavers are. Available prevention and mitigation strategies and their effectiveness. We're all doing that as well. The underlying cultural influences to the human perception of beavers. Relevant policy and legislation, and then considering working on that. Importance of long-term project monitoring and evaluation. And then, of course, just the fun science. The ecology, the behavior, the population studies, the benefits that beavers provide. All of that stuff is, of course, still super important. So I am still relatively new to the beaver world, and I would love to just continue this conversation with you all. This is my email address. If you have thoughts, reach out. Another thing that I love is the Beaver Management Forum on Facebook. It's a great place to also share thoughts and have conversations with others of us, even when BeaverCon is over, which is almost right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison.